Well, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Nice to virtually be with you again. This week, we begin the book of Leviticus. Not a favorite of most people. It's dealing with all these gory, bloody sacrifices and all these details, and what for? Well, there's an interesting perspective, if you'll allow me to explain. We've read up till now the first two books of the Torah, Genesis and Exodus. And if we think overall what's been taking place in those two books, there's been lots of chaos. In Genesis, we open with the creation of the world out of chaos, out of blackness, out of darkness, out of swirling all kinds of mishigas. God creates a world. And then once God creates the world, what happens? Nothing seems to go very well. You have Adam and Eve and eating from the tree that they're not supposed to, eating the fruit, and then Cain killing Abel, and then finally we get to Noah, and again, God's not happy with the world and brings this flood and only saves Noah. Lots of chaos, lots of disorganization, lots of destruction. The flood is over. Generations later, we are introduced to Abraham. Abraham has to leave his homeland, go to a new land. Abraham has his challenges. He marries Sarah, can't have a child. So he ends up with Sarah's maidservant Hagar, and he ends up with a son Ishmael. And then when Sarah does conceive and she has Isaac, the two of them don't get along, and Abraham has to cast Hagar and Ishmael out. A lot of chaos, a lot of confusion, a lot of terrible things going on. And then we have Isaac, and Isaac marries Rebekah, and they have two twins. That's what twins are, two. So you have Jacob and Esau, and they don't get along. And there's a battle amongst them, and Jacob stealing blessings from his almost blind father, and more chaos. And then we finally have Jacob and his 12 sons, and Joseph, and the tattletale, and thrown in a pit, sold off to Egypt. Again, more chaos, more tumult, more angst. The book of Genesis is filled with this stuff. And then finally we get to Exodus, when all of our ancestors are down in Egypt. And what's going on there? Enslavement, bondage, loss of freedom, being treated badly. And then God finally remembers our ancestors and brings 10 plagues. And there's plagues all over. And finally the people get to leave Egypt, and they're faced with the conundrum at the Red Sea, which finally gets parted for them. And then they get into the wilderness, and what happens in the wilderness? They complain, there's no food, there's no water. More chaos, more tumult, more confusion and craziness. And then there's the worshiping of the golden calf, and people die, and people are destroyed by God. And finally, at the very end of Exodus, we learn finally that God tells our ancestors to build a Mishkan, this tabernacle in the desert. Finally, at the end of these two books of the Torah, Genesis and Exodus, we're starting to get a little organization. We're starting to get some direction. God tells our ancestors, build this Mishkan, here's the laws. God has given Moses the 10 commandments, and our tradition teaches us the Torah as well. And he comes back to the people, they build this portable temple, and now we start to see some order. And finally, now we start the book of Leviticus. So what do we have in Leviticus? All these sacrifices. And chapters and chapters and verses galore, all about sacrifices. Leviticus opens up teaching us about burnt offerings, giving an offering from the flock of our cattle. And if not the flock of the cattle, not from our herds of cattle, the flocks of our sheep and goats. And if not from the sheep and goats, then from fowl, from birds. And if not from birds, from meal offerings. And the meal offerings, there's a detail of, is it a regular meal offering? Is it a pan meal offering? Is it an oven meal offering? Is it a deep dish meal offering? I feel like it's pizza time in the Torah. You can have like little crust, medium crust, and deep dish. You got all these meal offerings of different pans baked in the oven or in a pan. And then we get to a Zevach Shlamim, a peace offering. And that's just the beginning in the first few chapters of Leviticus. It goes on to talk about sin offerings and guilt offerings and all kinds of offerings. Chapters galore. And why do we have this? And why do we have all the details? Well, Finally, out of a world of confusion and chaos, we are starting to get the small minutia, the details of how to live life, of how to draw closer to God. And this was done through the sacrifices, through the korbanot in Hebrew. And literally, likarev means to draw near. This was the way in instituting these detailed sacrifices that our ancestors drew closer to God. So, out of this world of chaos, we finally get this idea of this small space, this tabernacle, and in this time where our ancestors finally have order. They have direction. They have commandments. They have details on how to live their life and how to draw closer to God. Bible scholar Samuel Ballantyne captured beautifully this idea when he said, "Who among us does not yearn for that one place, however small and difficult to find, that invites us to believe the very good world God created and the world in which we scratch out our very frail existence are in fact one and the same?" We understand that now. The world we're in seems frail. It seems confused. It's not well organized. We are deep in chaos. And yet, Leviticus comes right now to share with us the idea that perhaps the sacrifices that our ancestors made and the sacrifice we are making right now, quarantining ourselves. My son, who came down from New York, has been in his room for tomorrow it'll be a week straight, and he's got another week to go. For those of us who are self-quarantining, those of us who are not panic buying and sacrificing perhaps some of our own convenience so that others will have, the sacrifices that we are making in our jobs and being near loved ones who may live farther away, or the sacrifices we're making in not taking vacations and getting on cruise ships and going to hotels and getting on airplanes. All these sacrifices we make are intended to create a better, orderly world. And these sacrifices, I pray that we are making, will help draw us nearer to one another and to our community, and especially to God. Hang in there, friends. Shabbat shalom.